and Propenomix people as well. And Happy New Year, apart from anything else. So, what are you going to see and what are you going to learn about in today's supplement video recording? Well, I hope you'll see this is the only agenda-free UK property and macroeconomic roundup. We're going to talk a little bit about Trumponomics, of course, War and Peace. No, not the whole book, but you know what I mean there, I think. And then I'm going to use the deep dive section to look forward to the end of 2026. Where are we going to be by the end of this year on a property and macro basis? We've also got in the macro section nationwide house price index, which caused a bit of a stir, the manufacturing PMIs, which kicked the year off, and also the UK inclusive wealth and income accounts from the ONS. Don't have much chance to look at stuff like that normally, so it should be interesting. And also, I've also been using a lot of AI to help me out in terms of structuring the supplement, in terms of headings, in terms of content, in terms of the overall machine. And therefore, what I've been able to do is get the AI to predict what it thinks that I think is going to happen in 2026 from a macro basis. And then, being me, I'm also going to disagree with that a little bit, but not a lot, to be honest with you. It does a pretty scary job. So I don't know if 2026 is going to be the year where it's time for me to retire and submit to the mighty overlords of tech and AI. But can it do a better job than me? Stick around and you'll find out. So I like to always kick off with a quote. And this week's quote pertains to the deep dive, and it is, "When the facts change, I change my mind, sir. What do you do?" And that was from the legendary John Maynard Keynes, the economist and the father of the Keynesian school of economics, and indeed the post-Keynesian school, one way or another. Anyway, different interpretations of Keynes there ultimately. So how do I stack up compared to the AI's predictions after it allowing it to read all of my product from the whole of 2025? So, as the calendar creeps towards a new year, it's a natural time for us to pause and tackle the biggest challenges that keep SME property businesses from achieving true sustainable growth. For most, this boils down to two key areas: laying a bulletproof strategic plan for the next 12 months, and finally cracking the code on financial measurement and accountability. If you've ever felt lost in a sea of bookkeeping data or your productivity methods are falling short, it's time you switch from doing to leading and truly understand how your assets are performing. So book in on the next property business workshop with myself and Rod Turner, Thursday the 22nd of January in central London, tinyurl.com/PBWNINE, and there's a link in the show notes as well. So just a quick update first of all on Project Continuous Improvement of the supplement. I'm going to be carrying on with it throughout 2026. I got some great feedback on last week's edition, but it was one of the very best that I've done so far. So my Kaizen approach seems to be working. One to adopt there for 2026 if you don't already do that. But please, everybody, keep the feedback coming, and I'm grateful for what I've received so far. So Trumponomics, the Donald introduced an interesting concept this week. Net wars. I mean, he didn't say that, but that's one way of framing it, of course. Maduro has been disappeared, and one of my favourite pinball lines of all time, look, you know I'm a nerd, I mean, look at the shirt apart from anything else, is "Nobody messes with the USA." That comes from the legendary Attack from Mars from Williams in 1995. Thought to be a pastiche of "Don't Mess with Texas" and the Schwarzenegger-style one-liners that characterised so much of 1990s cinema. Now, I'm not going to get into the whys, whats and wherefores and the oil and all the rest of that. There's plenty of other commentary from people who know more than I do about oil apart from anything else. What we do know, though, is it makes sense to the way the current US inner circle sees the world. And it's a significant flex from a country that does not put itself into the mixer for international justice and that no one ever particularly stands up to. We know that the fentanyl line, which was part of the continued rhetoric against Venezuela ever since before Trump came back to office, and indeed in Trump 1.0 presidency apart from anything else, has no grounds in fact. It is perhaps just a veiled threat to Mexico and China, who are the root cause of the supply issue in the one-sided, ill-fated war on drugs that is ongoing at a cost of many trillions. Is the Donald seeking to take control of Venezuela as a means of reparations for damages to the US? Well, it sounds like one of the more worrying developments so far. Critique from Vladimir Putin must be about as low as it gets in international circles. But back to the economics. The concern will, as always, be a gap up in the price of oil, which is the only major investment class that underperformed Bitcoin in 2025. Oil price spikes cause inflation. The current options market suggested $2 to $5 when I wrote the supplement, it hasn't actually meant too much of a movement at all in oil. Of course, the primary argument here is Venezuela doesn't produce much oil anymore. The infrastructure has effectively pretty much rotted away. US sanctions, apart from anything else, have meant that, and that is on the back of actions Venezuela have taken, of course. The major point being the amount of reserves that Venezuela's got in the ground, more than anywhere else on the planet. And there's lots of schools of thought Trump's doing this because he doesn't want his frenemies to get it, China and Russia. He's not so worried about getting it himself. All sorts of different schools of thought, as I say, complex implications. What I would be concerned about is if it is inflationary, depending on what other people, other countries, other nations do on the back of what's happened here. Definitely outside of my wheelhouse, and I'm going to stop there. We don't know what's going to go on with Greenland and all the rest of it. We know what the rhetoric is, but we also know most people who've interpreted Trump in a relatively sensible way have said, don't take what he says literally, but do take it seriously. There's usually an agenda there somewhere, and the agenda with Greenland is somehow to take control of it, probably financially, I'd imagine. But it's not a comfortable place for us to be, I don't think. And in fact, it led to a new word being coined, Putinization of US foreign policy. I don't know if that's the best way to try and get into the Donald's head, apart from anything else, but the world doesn't stop Putin from taking what he wants. It does make it very, very hard for him to get there, as long as the people he's trying to take it from are willing to fight to the death, as they have been. And then they call in the Americans. Donald admires Vladimir and his strength. He said as much, so it isn't a giant leap to be more Putin, as Mr. Trump's resolution in 2026. What's anyone going to do about it anyway? Starmer has said a few words of very weak strength, to be honest, about upholding international law and won't take a position on it, which he's getting roundly criticised from his own party and all around the political spectrum. But it isn't a big stretch from use more route one brute force to get what we want to use route 2 or 3 subversive misinformation campaigns to get what we want in regimes who are, on paper, our allies or our rivals. Not that that hasn't already been going on, of course, and that's how international espionage has worked for 100 plus years. It's just different mediums that are applied these days to that, let's face it. But it does make things a lot more clear, I think, for those who are concerned enough about Mr. Trump, concerned enough to have devoted the whole opening of the supplement to him since his re-election, for example. The American people are not swallowing the reasoning just yet, with polling suggesting they are 70% opposed to these strikes, and that the vast majority don't believe this does have anything to do with fentanyl supply. But in much calmer news, the UK has been allowed to pump 13,000 tonnes of beef into the US market at a reduced tariff rate, in exchange for the US having a tariff-free rate for a similar quantity. And that kicked in on the 1st of January. And the £31 billion tech prosperity deal, as it's been framed, remains on ice as negotiations are ongoing regarding the digital services tax and the non-tariff barriers such as the hormone-fed beef, which still isn't allowed into the UK, and the chlorinated chicken that is allowed in the US and not the UK. But whilst restricting speech he doesn't like, the Trump administration continued to criticise the Online Safety Act for infringing on free speech. Well, all I can say is good luck to the UK's new ambassador to the US, Christian Turner. To my knowledge, he doesn't have nicknames like the Prince of Darkness, so perhaps he'll be a cut above the last one. He was knighted on the way in, presumably for extra impact, and we know that sort of thing carries a lot of favour with Mr. Trump. He looks well at the moment for 53 to me, but I'm sure the assignment will put some grey hairs in that well-coiffured hair. Or perhaps he just uses pictures as old as I do sometimes on his social media. But anyway, crack out the hot water bottle as we return to the relative safety of the real-time UK property market. Chris Watkin had the week off this week, but luckily I was able to find some of his predictions for 2026, which I've summarised below in his usual data-led style, which I happen to adore. So the core message is that market health is currently defined by volume, as in the level of activity, not by price inflation. Prices have flattened, but transaction numbers have surged, which does signal a robust and confident market for 2026. Perhaps it also evidences improved affordability, apart from anything else, which is great news for first-time buyers. So activity over price, that's the first point, the shift. And Mr. Watkin is arguing that the true measure of the market right now is how many homes are actually selling rather than their average price. So we're seeing rising volume. We know 2023 was a rough year. We saw 824,665 net sold subject to contracts. 2024 we saw 958,239, and 2025 we saw 997,472. So nearly got to the million there. But despite this surge in activity, average prices / cost per square foot barely changed. So it's a rebalancing of the market without prices climbing meaningfully. Now remember, this is nominal pricing. We have had a year of somewhat significant inflation, over the 3% mark overall by the time everything got into the books. So in theory, if things haven't moved a lot, that would see things cheaper, 3% cheaper in real terms. I think we're still going to see a price increase of about 1.5% when the ONS figures come in, but you'll see the nationwide figure was a bit more bearish than that when we get to that later on. What about the criticality of speed? So this is a really important stat for anyone who's thinking about selling a house in the near future. A direct correlation between how quickly a property sells and how likely the deal is to actually complete, avoiding a fall through. There's a golden window, it appears. If a home finds a buyer within 25 days, there's a 94% chance that that deal gets through to completion. Then there's a danger zone. If a sale is agreed after 100 days on the market, that chance of completion drops significantly to 56%. So currently, 53% of buyers of homes find a buyer within 35 days. That's the current stats. What are the key drivers of confidence? Well, there are some structural forces, Chris says, that are fueling this renewed activity. Economic factors such as falling mortgage rates, low unemployment, I'm not so sure about that one myself, but technically it is still low from a historical perspective. It's just the direction of travel that's got people like myself worried. And wage growth outpacing inflation have restored affordability. Supply shortage as well. A chronic deficit of housing in the UK, which we've known about for many years. We need 300,000 a year. That's exactly why the Labour government put that 1.5 million homes target out there. We're only delivering about 210,000, and things are getting worse before they get better. We know that. So there's this permanent floor of demand, ultimately. And then there's lifestyle as well. You know, post-pandemic priorities such as outdoor space. If you remember, for years and years, gardens were getting less and less important. That very much reversed itself in 2020. And then also flexibility are continuing to drive decisions. So you can still watch Chris's most recent property market stats show on his YouTube at Christopher Watkin, and I highly recommend it because his guest really knew his onions. Yes, it was me who did week 49 with Chris at the end of 2025. So he always gets this weekly shout out from me because of all the stats he comes out with on a weekly basis, on a daily basis, frankly, via his LinkedIn. He's getting that extra glow up because of me being on the show. Of course he is, but do drop him a like, a subscribe, all the rest of it, some kind words for his content creation. And if you're in the property industry and you're looking to improve your knowledge and your positioning in your local market, that's what Chris does as his core business. So give him a shout. I'm sure we'll be back to business as usual with the Property Market Stats Show next week, and we'll have the real-time stats, the first ones for 2026. So the macroscope was still just blowing off its dust in Betwixtmas, as it's called, although obviously that period is now over. We had the nationwide house price reports, which caused a bit of a stir, and also it was the end of the quarter, so that bit that no one ever reports on needs its quarterly update too. We also had the final manufacturing PMI, which I'll take a look at. And then there's a gap, which I'm filling with the ONS Inclusive Wealth and Income Accounts UK, released in late December 2025, but only running until 2023 figures. I know it beggars belief, but it's still interesting fodder, so I wanted to mention it. And then, you know, even on the lightest week, we still need to talk about the gilts and the swaps, so that brings up the rear as always. So nationwide in their index, it was a surprise for many. Indeed, the tick down of 0.4% on house prices in December was a fair way away from the economic consensus of a plus 0.1%. But I wasn't overly surprised when they printed a mere 0.6% increase for the whole of 2025. Why was I not surprised? Well, at the end of 2024, they printed 4.7% increase for the year, which by anyone's numbers was over-enthusiastic. And so the base effects of that print have got to them, in my view, and they recognise that themselves in their analysis, which is an improvement because normally they post and run in these situations. So what do they say in their own analysis? That word resilient again, in spite of subdued consumer sentiment. They once again flagged the inevitable glut of transactions before a stamp duty change, and then the lull in the aftermath after the 31st of March 2025. They highlight affordability constraints easing somewhat, and they note the highest share of high loan to value lending, which they classify as 85% and above, for a decade. So what's struggled? Well, London, the South and the East. Don't think there's any news there of note necessarily. They throw a dart at 2 to 4% house price growth for next year. So let's interpret that as 3%. It's not a bad spread, really, is it? Then one last roundup for their 2025 report. Flats lost nearly 1% of their value, whereas terraced houses gained 1.8, detached 2.2 and semis 2.4. So quite illuminating. The bit they left out, the RPI adjusted real house prices that they still produce on an automated basis every quarter. Now, if you've watched before, you'll have heard this bit from me in the past, but aside from a very small wobble in 2013, after the post-crash market hit its nationwide bottom, house prices, when adjusted for RPI, are back where they were in early 2003. You heard that right. If adjusted for inflation, house prices are back now to nearly where they were nearly 23 years ago. There's only 1 quarter to go. Quite a lot when you think about it. So what about the manufacturing PMI? The flash number had been brilliant before Christmas. 51.2 was the best print we'd seen for a long, long time. The final print was 50.6. So whilst it's a shame it's rode back a little bit, that's still a 15-month high of the manufacturing PMI. Production growth was supported by stock building and new order uptick. Input price inflation accelerated, though. The domestic market was the one responsible for the growth, although the export market looked to stabilise. The report talks of reduced headwinds, so the budget being behind us, the JLR cyber attack behind us, and less concern over tariffs. But the fear would be if the rubber band has snapped back and we only got to 50.6, will things just fall away again in 2026? And then the report closes by describing falling business confidence. So it might just be an anomalous print, unfortunately. We'll find out next month. Now, what about this mercurially titled Inclusive Wealth and Income Accounts for 2023? Well, for this one, I've gone with a summary. The economy is bigger than GDP and it's not recovered yet. So we're all guilty of obsessing over the gross domestic product. It is that headline number. All the politicians and economists cling to it. But what if the map is not the territory? The ONS has released some fascinating official statistics in development that try and measure the real economy, the stuff that GDP misses and the stuff that I think we should be talking about on a day-to-day basis. So they call it gross inclusive income, or GII, and net inclusive income, or NII. So we know that GDP only measures a value added, market transactions, whereas these metrics look at unpaid work in the economy, like household work, ecosystem services, and the assets that we need to keep the lights on. So what is the real value of work? Well, here's their headline. If you count the invisible work we do, cooking, cleaning, childcare, our economic output is massive. In 2023, GII per person was about £66,000 compared to GDP's £40,003. That unpaid household stuff, it's huge, equivalent to 77% of the entire market economy. But here's where it gets sticky. While standard GDP figures suggest we've bounced back to pre-COVID peaks, these broader measures disagree. GII and NII have not returned to their pre-pandemic highs. In fact, for 2023, growth for these metrics was not growth at all. It went backwards. GII fell by 0.1% and NII fell by 1.2%. So why is there this disconnect? Well, there's 2 things primarily happening here. First, the home economy hasn't fully recovered. Unpaid household services per person are still 3.2% below 2019 levels. Big chunk of this is transport. We're just not driving and commuting as much as we used to. You can blame that on working from home or hybrid working if you want, but that counts to a drop towards household production volume. Secondly, and more worryingly, is the NII figure, because this strips out depreciation. It asks, are we getting richer or are we just burning the furniture to heat the house? NII is down because we're wearing out our assets. And this was something that I said during COVID. Time moves on. Every single building got a year older in 2020, even if there wasn't the typical level of maintenance. It simply wasn't possible because of lockdowns, apart from anything else. So this is a reflection of the pandemic, ultimately. Depreciation of produced capital, as it's known at the ONS, so that's machinery and buildings, is dragging us down as the stock increases and wear and tear sets in. And furthermore, our human capital is being eroded at a faster rate than before. So is there a silver lining here? Well, it's not all doom and gloom. Natural capital depreciation has actually improved compared to 2005. Why? Because greenhouse gas emissions have fallen. We're doing less damage to the atmosphere, which counts as a positive on the balance sheet of these metrics. But what's the bottom line? GDP's told us we're recovering, but these inclusive accounts tell us we're still carrying the scars of 2020. We have 73% of our production available for consumption without eating into our wealth, but the trend is clear. Purely market-based measures are masking a weaker reality in our households and our capital stock. We need to pay attention to this. You can't spend GDP, but you definitely feel the inclusive income in your daily life. And perhaps this speaks a little bit as towards why we're not feeling and seeing growth. And I'll get onto that a little bit more later as well. How do you think 2024 and 2025 will be recorded after more impact of the cost of living crisis, including that fiscal drag of these frozen tax thresholds, which are causing everyone a problem? Is it just a case of one more metric we didn't really need to tell us things aren't really going that well at the individual household level or the aggregated household level? Maybe so. But on the bright side, this data takes so long to produce, we can't even blame the Labour government for this. It was 7 months before they got elected. Okay, what about the gilts and swaps for the short week then? Well, it was a nothing week. There was no real new information. The open on the 5-year at 3.955% yield and the close at 3.963% yield. Literally nothing to report. On the 30s, it was a bit different. It was very flat until New Year's Eve, and then it took a bit of a walk on Friday. So the yield on the 30s opened at 5.219 and then closed at 5.278. So we saw a 6 basis point walk, reversing what happened last time out, which was last week. And so the yield curve got a bit steeper again. Now the 5-year swap stayed rooted around that 3.6% mark, closed on Friday at 3.605, almost identical to its close on the 2nd of December 2025, and 40 basis points below where it closed on the 2nd of January 2025 at 4.01%. Regulars will know I prefer these nothing weeks, but when I do see them, I'd like to see a little bit of decay in the yield rather than firmness. But of course, I always want to have my cake and eat it. And that segues us nicely into the deep dive, because my prediction around the 5-year swap rate is that it isn't going to drop a lot below 3.5%, presuming the interest rate holds up and there's no particular crisis to speak of that would see interest rates slash dramatically. And I'm talking about a genuine crisis as well, a grey swan or a black swan, a proper recession, something like that. The base rate might well go below 3.5%, but I don't think it will take the swap down with it based on the current shape of the yield curve. So you guessed it, the deep dive has to be predictions for 2026. I ran an interesting experiment to kick things off this year. I trained the AI model that I use in deep research mode to gather the economic consensus of all of the larger, more significant industry forecasters, forecasting houses, banks, industry heavyweights, consultants, etc. I then asked the AI to read the last 52 Sunday supplements and tell me what I would be predicting. Bit weird, isn't it, really? Well, here's the output anyway. What's the consensus view on UK house prices? Up 2 to 2.5%. What does it think I should be saying? Up 1.5%. In real terms, negative, realistically. UK base rate, 3.25%. That's what the industry consensus is. I'm saying 3.5%. 5-year SONIA swaps, 3.17% is roughly what the consensus thinks by the end of the year. I think 3.45 or so. So again, I'm a few basis points higher there. Where will the 5-year limited company mortgage rate sit? Between 4.75 and 5%. I don't think it's going to go below about 5.45 as a general rule. I see that as the new normal floor. So that's just 2% on top of my bottom for the swap rate, of course. It can go a little bit under that because the lowest products are a little bit lower than 2% margin, but I'm happy being roughly at that level. CPI inflation, the consensus says 2.1. I say 2.8 because I think it's still going to be stickier than thought before. Core CPI, roughly 2.5%. Propenomix forecast is going to be 3.2% on that one. I don't think core is really seeing what we need to drop significantly. And services inflation, the consensus is about 4%. I'm sticking at closer to 5. I'm sticking at 4.7 on the AI model. Unemployment, the consensus is 5%. I think that's super hopeful. The AI model says 5.4. Real household, I think, a bit higher, but we'll get into that in a moment. Real household disposable income. This is one of my favourite metrics of all that the ONS produces because it's adjusted for inflation, but it talks, a lot of people talk about GDP, and then often the point is made that GDP per capita is a better metric per head, because if you import lots of people like we have done in the UK over some relatively recent years, then you're just growing by bringing more people into the country. You're not growing by increasing output per person, per worker, per anything else. Now, the model thinks we'll drop 0.2% on real household disposable income. The consensus is about half a percentage point gain, but as I say, I'll get into that in some detail. Average earnings, the consensus is about 3%. I think it'll be more like 3.8 with another skew towards the public sector. Rental inflation, or the ONS private index of property and rent, 4 to 5%. I've got 6.5% according to the AI model because of a supply side glut because of the Renters' Rights Act, apart from anything else. I can understand why it's picked that up in my writings over the past 12 months. And then the minimum wage increase for 2027, when we get there, consensus 3.5%, the AI model says 4.2%. So remember, it's not necessarily what I think, but it is what I should think according to the AI model and the supplements that I wrote and spoke of last year. Perhaps it isn't the best methodology because, like this week's quote, when the facts change, I do change my mind. But nonetheless, it's a pretty good starting point. So I'm going to address them all in turn. I do like the forecast of 1.5% for capital growth. Not that it means great results for all of us who are asset owners, it doesn't. But I think London prices remain in a bit of a hole, and they, alongside the southeast, are likely to keep the overall returns depressed a little bit during 2026. So I can live with that 1.5% prediction. I also believe that supply, followed by the huge reported Boxing Day bounce of record listings, is going to stay higher than any vendors would like in early 2026, at least. Base rate, this is really going to come down to how much trouble we are or aren't in. I've had a couple of comments on my YouTube in the past couple of weeks, which are ultimately misinformed, I'm afraid, saying that the Bank of England only has a mandate to control inflation. This is not correct. They prioritise inflation control first and foremost, but they have mandates over the stability of the entire financial system, which is why they have a deputy governor for it, and also for markets and banking, which is why they have a deputy governor for that. The CEO of the PRA is the fourth deputy governor for prudential regulation. The upshot of that, if the bank needed to cut rates to help the economy, particularly in a period of rising and sustained unemployment, are we there? And inflation wouldn't likely suffer too much, they would absolutely do it. And this is the crux of the argument of those forecasting 2.75% base rates in this next year. But I do fear they're suffering from a bit of hope, a bit of recency bias, and a case of thinking that central bankers move faster than they do. Remember, the last vote was 5-4 in favour of the cutters, and it doesn't get more disjointed than that. If we do see inflation down at 2% in Q2, which is what the Bank of England have been predicting, that's great, but it's still at target, it's not beneath it. It's by no means clear that the rate will be cut multiple times. My gut feel is we still end the year between 3.25% and 3.5%, and therefore I don't feel strongly enough to knock back the 3.5% prediction that the model has made. So pretty good so far. 5-year SONIA swaps end at 3.45%. As I say, it's probably still close enough not for me to argue. There does certainly seem to be this floor around 3.5% because the longer part of the yield curve is demanding such a premium. Look at the 30s, they're still 5.25%. As we go 5 years down the track, we're 5 years nearer to that 5 years into that 30-year period, aren't we? So that would, with the steepness of the yield curve at the moment, what that implies is that rates will be higher in the future than they are today, not the same or lower. So all this thinking that we're going to return to the low interest rate days, it just seems to be unlikely to me, apart from anything else. So is that the yield curve shaped like that? So we're told, because of productivity problems, because of healthcare issues, and because of climate change issues. None of those are getting sorted out in 2026, in my opinion. So it's not a bad squeak, which would see a limited company mortgage rate sitting between 5.25 and 5.5. As the model said, 5.45, that's fine, no problem. Okay, what about inflation? 2.8% at the end of the year. Well, the economy will need some heat back in it. Back to the uncertainty around unemployment, but on a central forecast, since I usually sit there saying 3% is the new 2%, you're not going to see me arguing with 2.8% either. Core, it's put in a floor at 3.2%, and I think I know why the model has picked that up, because I do mention it semi-regularly. But that is looking backwards. Is that hard-coded into inflation? So I'm going to go under on the core and go for 2.7% by the end of 2026. Services inflation has stayed high. Similar logic to core CPI though, and again, I'm going to back the unders and go for 3.75% on services inflation instead. Now, unemployment, the model has only gone to 5.4%. I'm a little bit surprised by that, because a number of times, especially recently, I've been perfectly willing to explore scenarios that see unemployment at 6%. I certainly think over 5.5 by the end of 2026, and in fact, I'm going for 5.7% instead. Real household disposable income then. Now, I totally agree on this prediction. The only reason it won't be worse is because inflation really is on the way down, and there's a lag benefit where already negotiated wage rises will therefore perform better than expected, thanks to lower inflation when they actually kick in. But a small negative looks highly likely to me for real household disposable income. Average earnings, the model's stuck 3.8%, and I can see where it's coming from. I often say how sticky wages are. A lot of this depends on just how brutal or not the job market becomes. Companies are ultimately working to smaller margins than they were pre-COVID, and I expect to see them trying to recover from some of their staff costs, which have ballooned. If I'm right on unemployment, that will put pressure on average earnings, but where will doctors settle, for example, and what will that do to public sector wages? I could see private sector wage increases at 3%, but perhaps with the newfound approach to taking the brakes off public sector pay rises, regardless of the cost of unaffordable pension schemes, it will be the case that that number remains high. Remember, September's inflation number was bad at 3.8%, when that's the number used for index-linked benefits, pensions and the like, and when the public sector pay review bodies are back, this is the number they're going to take into account. Now, it only affects pensions if that's the one part of the triple lock that kicks in, of course. Rental inflation, the model has obviously gone big at 6.5%. I have got a bit of a problem with this, a twofold problem really. Number one, I don't see London doing the heavy lifting to contribute towards a 6.5% private rents increase. I don't see some kind of big reversal of what's going on there at the moment. I'd be more tempted to go 3.5% or something, simply because of the fiscal drag, these frozen tax thresholds, and therefore the resulting affordability of people. I think there's an exodus underway, but many smaller landlords are just selling to bigger ones, and people have a long time to do anything in property, and they take a long time to do anything as well. So we're only predicting what's going to happen by the end of the year, which will be honest before we realise. Now, if I'm wrong on this, if I'm on the downside of this, jolly good. Not many listening to this wouldn't accept the 6.5%. It would probably be a great result, but personally, I don't see it happening. I think 3.5% is more where I think things will be. What about the continued minimum wage increase? Well, there does seem to be largely heavily entrenched ideology from the incumbents, and let's just spend a bit of a moment on that. The Conservatives figured, I think in their 14 years in power, that the way forward was to raise the minimum wage because they were effectively subsidising the working poor otherwise. Also, unemployment was very low indeed, 3.5% at certain points, so why not put the minimum wage up and do a bit of rebalancing? As long as people are working, not too many mind that sort of behaviour. Now, let's fast forward. The party that proudly introduced the minimum wage, which at the time really wasn't in the money, i.e. it didn't actually push wages up for unskilled jobs, wants to help ramp it up with relative poverty, to help the working poor, if you prefer the phrase than relative poverty. So not incredibly different from the last lot, but with a different manifestation and a more rabid hunger to press on regardless of the damage to individual business sectors such as hospitality. So I'm not going to argue with the 4.2% in 2027. I can see the low pay commission buying right into that one. So that covers the economic ones, and I can nearly retire happy, it seems, although remember the model is pretty much trained on what I already think, or I should be thinking, so my primary source contribution is still important. Sure thing, Adam, you keep telling yourself that. Well, what about the non-economic for 2026? Let's start with political. The Labour Party will still be in charge on New Year's Eve 2026. I'm sorry to break that to you. Will Keir Starmer? Well, there's a 50-50 chance of a new leader, according to the betting markets. And if Sir Keir Starmer goes, you know that Rachel Reeves is going too. There is a way that Starmer stays and Reeves goes, of course, but the election results in May, we pretty much know, are going to be really bad. For the Labour Party anyway. But insiders say, however, Starmer will not leave of his own volition. It's very hard for Labour to remove a leader. It doesn't work the same way as the Conservative Party. So the best we might get is that he doesn't stand at the next election as the leader, according to the party insiders. The argument is the market's biased, simply because it's got that recency bias towards how often the Tories change Prime Minister in between 2019 and 2024. But remember, the governance structures of the two parties are extremely different. So I'm going to be contrarian and say that he will still be in his post by the end of 2026. And so will Rachel Reeves. And I'm sorry in advance for that. Will they at least manage the budget a little bit better this year in terms of leaks and the likes? It would be hard not to. Rayner, will she have been brought back? I suspect she's too powerful not to have been. Starmer will try to boost his ailing popularity with a strategic return to the front bench for Ange. It will be sickeningly hypocritical, but only because she makes honest mistakes. It'll all be fine, apparently. What about the property-related bits for 2026 then? Well, it's time for the talking to stop. The housing completion figures are going to be truly woeful. That's basically a known quantity already. And there will have to be some significant overrules in terms of grey belts, new towns and the likes to make a real difference. We're looking at a concrete versus countryside civil war of sorts, if you like some dramatic framing. And playing right into the hands of the Lib Dems and the Greens, who are already assaulting on the left flank. More tax or restriction on joy in general, whether that be gambling, unhealthy foods or similar. My own personal view is that a tax on ultra-processed foods is what we need to drive the right sort of behaviour, but how unpopular would the takeaway tax, or whatever you would call it, become? I mean, it'd be hugely unpopular. It's the perfect crime for an unpopular party, though, because they can raise more tax money without it being seen as a tax-raising exercise. Now, what have the Labour Party been doing over the first few days of 2026? They've been talking about just how much better things are going to get and what an improvement it will be. And this is the year where it gets better. And whether that's seen as this is Keir Starmer's last roll of the dice, I don't know, bearing in mind comments already made on that front. But the May 2026 elections will go very badly from the Labour Party perspective, but the result will not be a great deal. That's my best case position until the facts change. One last one, I think there'll be a cabinet reshuffle. It will be framed in the press as a last roll of the dice, because if this is really correct and Starmer does survive 2026, it really is last chance saloon to get some results in 2027 and 2028, and he's going to put that in there as hopefully a little blocker, a little tickle, a little now we can do something different. The team's changed. He did say people had 2 years as ministers. Obviously, that would take them to July or arguably sort of September, October, really, because of the summer recess 2026. But that might be the time for a bit of a reshuffle. I first used the word treacle to describe the progress of the economy in the wake of the whole Liz Truss debacle. And that's now more than 3 years ago. I wonder how that lettuce is doing anyway. But the reality of 2026, boring though it might sound, is that more treacle is the most likely outcome. But take heart, flat markets are great for buying. All the small landlords, or many anyway, want to go. There won't be enough buyers, especially for tenanted stock. If you wanted a mistake to avoid in 2026, it would be trying to sell a property with a tenant in situ. Imagine the risk you take on these days if you buy a tenanted property without perfect compliance documents. My goodness me, the risk premium of that has gone up 100% or more, in my view, and I'm sure other buyers will see it in the same way. One more point before I leave it there, more easing in mortgage lending. This looks likely, and maybe a Q1 2026 thing, which would help the market move forward a little more, depending on exactly who is within scope and what difference it will be proven to make. All good reasoning for keeping calm. But as we kick off 2026 proper, the next property business workshop is filling up. Early bird ticket sales are in their last few days of sale now. We're starting the year with a bang, discussing strategic planning and how to make the most of the next 12 months, with some of our own methods and our takes on productivity and time management alongside systems and processes. The other half of the workshop is about the most common pain point in SME property businesses: accounts, bookkeeping and group accounting. This is about measuring your asset performance, not how to use Xero, but how to make the most out of financial information. What should you be seeing monthly, and how should you interpret it properly and use it strategically to grow your business safely but quickly? As always, we have real life case studies about our own experiences and close with our no holds barred Q&A. Have you got anything individual to consider? Get a VIP ticket and join us for dinner in a smaller setting with an opportunity to discuss any specific roadblocks or issues in your property business at the moment. Those dinner tickets are nearly sold out now. Well done to those who've already booked on. There are 3 left as I'm speaking right now. Don't miss out on them. It's the best way to get a substantial conversation with myself, Rod, and other experienced property business people. So join us on Thursday, the 22nd of January 2026 in central London. The booking link is tinyurl.com/PBWNINE, and it's in the show notes. But above all, whatever you do, please remember to keep calm. Always listen to the supplement and carry on, because there's going to be opportunities abound this year and towards 2030 and beyond. The landscape has been set for a surefire bull run. Capital growth looks likely set to remain slow-ish at the moment, especially according to my predictions, as you've seen today. But if you're in the right part of the UK, I think you'll be well looked after by the combination of that plus inflation. This big bull run is going to need some runway first, although let's see what the FCA and the PRA do around easing lending requirements again. But let's have an amazing golden quarter together. It's a case of here we go, in my opinion. Thanks for tuning in, folks. Have a good week.